My name is Hassan Yilmaz, and I've been the warden of the Lake 2's Special Environmental Protection Area for nearly 2 decades. If you've ever visited the central Anatolian plains of Turkey, you may have heard about our salt lake, Tuzgolu, a blinding white expanse that stretches across the horizon like a frozen sea. But this isn't a story about the lake. It's about a flamingo, just one, who arrived here by accident and stayed for reasons I still think about every day. We had just entered the spring of 2021. The pandemic was still gripping the world, but here in the quiet heart of Turkey, nature carried on without pause. Flamingos are no strangers to Lake Tuz. Each year, tens of thousands of them descend here during breeding season, transforming the lake into a pink mirage. But they never stay longer than a few months. They come, they breed, they feed, and then they leave. That year, migration began as expected. I'd been walking my usual patrol around the southern shore of the lake, binoculars in hand and notebook tucked in my vest pocket. That's when I first saw her, a lone flamingo, circling lower and lower, wings wobbling in the wind. Something was off. Flamingos usually arrive in flocks, choreographed in flight like ballet dancers. This one, she was alone. She landed clumsily in the shallows near the old wooden observation hut, her wings trembling, legs trembling even more. I remember thinking she wouldn't last long. The salt flats are unforgiving. If you don't come prepared, the sun and the silence can drive even the most resilient creature away. I reported the sighting back to the Regional Wildlife Monitoring Office in Konya. They took note but didn't find it unusual. Flamingos get blown off course occasionally, and one landing early wasn't necessarily a cause for concern. But then, a few weeks passed, and she didn't leave. She didn't rejoin the flocks arriving from Africa or the Nile Delta. Instead, she carved out her own space on the eastern end of the lake, near the salt pans abandoned years ago. There were still pools of brackish water there, rich with algae and brine shrimp, enough to sustain a flamingo, at least for a while. I started keeping closer track of her. I named her Alaz, meaning flame in Turkish, for her resilience, for her soft pink feathers that seemed to deepen in color by the week, and perhaps because I needed to name her to make sense of what I was witnessing. Alaz behaved differently than any flamingo I had ever observed. Flamingos are skittish. They don't like to be alone, and they don't stay still for long. But Alaz made a routine. She would feed in the morning, stretch her wings at midday, then rest in a shallow pool till evening. I would sit for hours with my binoculars, watching her from a distance. In time, she began to tolerate my presence. She didn't fly off when I approached the edge of the shore. She would glance at me, not fearfully, just calmly, almost curiously. By late summer, the rest of the flamingos had begun their departure southward. I remember that last day of the main migration. The sky was filled with the cries of thousands of birds, flapping in unison. I stood on the northern embankment and watched the pink tide lift into the air and vanish into the distance. And there she was, still standing knee-deep in saltwater, watching them go. That was the moment I knew she had decided to stay. I spent the following autumn keeping an eye on her. Flamingos aren't built for Anatolian winters. The wind is harsh, and the temperatures can drop below freezing. Most years, the salt crust gets thick enough to crack beneath your boots. I worried for her survival, but each time I visited, there she was. When the water froze in the shallows, she moved to deeper pools fed by underground springs. She always seemed to know where to go. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Local birdwatchers had begun talking. A lone flamingo overwintering in Tuz Lake? Unheard of. Some thought she must be sick, injured, or disoriented. But every photo they took showed a healthy bird, standing tall and elegant, her feathers immaculate. By the time spring returned in 2022, so did the interest. Nature photographers began arriving, first a few, then dozens. Alaz had become something of a celebrity. She'd pose in perfect silhouette at dawn, her reflection mirrored in the still water. People were mesmerized by her grace, her quiet defiance of nature's patterns. And yet, she never sought out other flamingos. That spring, when the great flocks returned from the south once more, she did not join them. She stayed near the same salt pans, waiting alone, her head low and graceful, her movements serene. Some of the newly arrived flamingos passed near her, but there was no reunion. No joining. It was as if she had become something else, no longer part of the flock, no longer passing through. She had become a resident. I must admit, I grew attached to her. I took to documenting her daily life with notes, photos, even time-lapse videos. I never thought a single bird could alter the rhythm of my work so drastically. She had. That summer, tourism to Two's Lake surged. Our little wooden visitor center, dusty and rarely used, suddenly had lines of people outside. Families, photographers, students, travelers from Istanbul and beyond. All wanted to catch a glimpse of the flamingo that stayed. Some called her the lonely flamingo. Others preferred the wise one. I didn't care much for the names. To me, she was just Alaz. But something had shifted. I saw it in the faces of the people who came. In a world that seemed more unpredictable than ever, here was a creature that had gone off course and made a life anyway. Not out of weakness, but through quiet, deliberate adaptation. She became a symbol of calm, of survival without fanfare. I was asked to speak about her at the Regional Ecological Summit that fall. I remember ending my talk with a sentence I hadn't planned: perhaps Alaz didn't get lost. Perhaps she simply found what she needed sooner than the rest. That winter, as the lake froze once again, I watched her from the same wooden platform, snow blowing sideways across the flats. She stood in the warm spring-fed water near the marsh edge, head tucked into her feathers. The tourists were gone, the photographers back in their cities, but Alaz stayed, silent, poised, and absolutely at home. That's where I'll pause for now. Because the second year, well, that's when things truly changed. When the winter of 2022 gave way to spring, I didn't expect Alaz to stay another year. Most birds that deviate from their migratory patterns do it once, maybe because of weather, disorientation, or injury, and then return to their instincts. But not Alaz. She welcomed her second spring on Two's Golu like a landowner returning home. That season, something else arrived too: attention. Real, institutional attention. Our story, her story, had begun to spread beyond birdwatcher forums and local news. Turkish environmental agencies, European wildlife foundations, and even a few international outlets started contacting us. A lone flamingo overwintering at one of the world's largest salt lakes, and thriving? It defied decades of migratory data. Journalists visited with long lenses and curious questions. Why did she stay? Is she okay? Do flamingos adapt this way often? I had no easy answers. What I knew was what I saw: a healthy bird, alert and strong, following a routine as if she had been born here. I gave them what I could: daily patterns, feeding spots, behavior notes. I kept meticulous records. She bathed more frequently than other flamingos. She favored certain pools and avoided others, perhaps because of salt concentrations. She responded calmly to humans but avoided other birds, even gulls. In April, a biologist from Ankara University visited and asked if we could try tagging her with a GPS tracker. The goal was to monitor her movements and gather data for broader studies on climate-related changes in migratory behavior. We debated the ethics for days. I was hesitant. Alaz wasn't a specimen to me. She was, by now, a presence in my life. But we agreed, if we could catch her safely and minimize distress, it might help conservation efforts. The tagging happened at dawn, mid-May. A quiet, careful operation. 3 wildlife experts and I used a light net while she fed in a shallow pool. She panicked for only a moment before calming. The device was small, solar-powered, and fit on one leg like a thin anklet. It wouldn't interfere with her movement. Within 10 minutes, she was back in the water. And that's when we started to see the real patterns. The GPS data showed she had a range of about 7 kilometers, moving daily between 3 specific zones around the lake: 2 old salt pans, and 1 geothermal marsh near a now-defunct well. The geothermal activity there kept the water slightly warmer in winter, making it possible for her to access food year-round. It explained how she had survived the first harsh winter and suggested she might survive another. By June, the second wave of flamingos arrived. I watched closely, wondering if she'd finally reconnect with the flock. At one point, a group of juveniles settled near her pool. They waited within meters. One even mirrored her movements. But after a few days, they drifted on. Alaz stayed. Tourist traffic exploded that summer. Word had spread not just across Turkey but to international travel circles. Suddenly, we had birdwatchers from the UK, Spain, even Japan. Tour companies from Cappadocia started offering day trips to see the famous Flamingo of Tuz Lake. Our visitor center received funding for upgrades, a new observation platform, shaded walkways, and educational signage about the lake's biodiversity. Local businesses benefited. Cafes in nearby Sarıflıkçılar added flamingo-themed drinks. One even painted a mural of her, Alaz, with her slender curved neck and vivid pink wings, across its outside wall. I was interviewed 3 times that summer. Each time, I said the same thing: Alaz is not just a flamingo. She's a reminder that nature is not static. That adaptation is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like standing still in the right place. But there were concerns too. Lake Tuz has been shrinking. Climate change, agricultural irrigation, and groundwater overuse have all taken their toll. The lake that once shimmered with life was turning patchy and brittle in places. I remember standing with a team of hydrologists and conservationists that August. We reviewed satellite images. Sections of the lake were evaporating faster than expected. That made Alaz even more important. She became a focal point for environmental advocacy. If she could survive here, perhaps others could too, if we protected the habitat. Schoolchildren began drawing her in art projects. One class from Konya sent me a handwritten booklet, Alaz'a Mektuplar, Letters to Alaz. Dozens of pages, each one with crayon illustrations and notes like, "Stay strong, beautiful bird," or "We will save your lake." She had become more than a curiosity. She had become a story of survival, a face for a cause. In September, the Konya Plain Project, a regional conservation initiative, announced a new allocation of funding for Salt Lake preservation. Part of the proposal referenced Alaz by name. I smiled when I read it. A flamingo that no one expected to matter had become a stakeholder in policy. Her second winter was milder than the first, perhaps due to broader weather changes. But it was still bitter. I saw her less frequently, but she stayed near the geothermal marsh, as before. The tracker confirmed she remained active. Each time I visited, I would sit on a bench near the edge and scan the pale water until her shape appeared. She never hid. She simply existed, patient and unwavering. In February of 2023, an environmental documentary team came to film her. They brought drones, slow-motion cameras, and a small production crew. I helped them set up a temporary blind for unobtrusive filming. The footage they captured was stunning. Alaz framed against a glowing sunrise, her silhouette alone in the silver-pink lakebed. That image would later appear on posters, nature magazines, and even social media campaigns. By the time spring returned, it was clear, this was not a fluke. Alaz had made Lake Tuz her home. But that spring, something else changed. She began to interact, just slightly, with a small group of young flamingos who lingered past the usual breeding window. 4 or 5 of them, not part of any major flock. They were quiet, erratic in their movement, and mostly kept to themselves. But Alaz let them near her pool. Once, I watched as 2 of them followed her in a half-circle, mimicking her feeding rhythm. It wasn't bonding, not quite. But it was the first sign she might no longer be entirely alone. The scientists noted this too. One ornithologist visiting from Spain proposed that Alaz's behavior might influence future patterns, that she could become the nucleus of a new, possibly permanent micropopulation if conditions allowed. That was still speculation, but I couldn't help but think, what if they were right? Her story was still unfolding. And by the end of that second year, it was clear that she was no longer just the flamingo that stayed. She was a catalyst. That fall, a school built a small wooden sculpture of her at the edge of the lake path. Children touched it as they passed. Pilgrims from nearby villages visited. A wedding couple came for photos with her in the background. A group of international biologists requested to name the geothermal marsh unofficially as Alaz's Pool in their fieldwork maps. I walked the salt flats one evening in late November. The wind was low. The sky was a sheet of indigo. I saw her standing in the distance, backlit by the last edge of sunlight. Just her. No flock. No noise. A figure of impossible poise against a land of extremes. That image stayed with me through the winter. And as we prepared for the spring of 2024, I began to realize, this story wasn't ending. It was only beginning. By the time spring arrived in 2024, Alaz had spent 2 full years at Lake Tuz. Not passed through, not visited, stayed, and something subtle but undeniable had changed in the landscape, and in me. I remember the morning well. April 2nd. The sun rose gently over the salt crust, throwing a soft pink hue across the lake. I took my usual walk from the east watchpoint to the geothermal pools. The marsh steam drifted across the flats. And there she was, Alaz, standing in exactly the same place as she had a year before. Graceful, motionless, serene. But this time, she wasn't alone. 5 other flamingos waited near her, forming a loose crescent. All juveniles, all untagged. Whether they had followed her from the previous year or were drawn to her pool by instinct, I couldn't say. But they were staying. Not just feeding, staying. I reported it immediately to the Wildlife Research Institute in Ankara. Within days, a new wave of interest swept in. Ornithologists began speaking cautiously but excitedly of an emergent, satellite residency group. This wasn't a migratory pause. It was possible we were witnessing the start of localized residency, behavior nearly unprecedented in this species in Anatolia. No longer just a lone flamingo off course. Now, possibly, the first matriarch of a resident cluster. And yet Alaz remained unchanged. She didn't display dominance, didn't lead them. But they followed her movements. If she relocated to another pool, they moved a few minutes later. I watched this for days. There was no aggression, no posturing, only quiet synchronicity. Meanwhile, tourists returned in greater numbers. Spring 2024 broke all previous records. The new visitor center, expanded in late 2023 with provincial support, could barely handle the demand. There were now observation decks built into the salt bed, wooden boardwalks winding to marked flamingo viewing points. We had set up QR codes for birdwatchers to track live GPS data of Alaz through her tag. People stood in silence watching a single dot move slowly across the rendered map. Some even cried. And then came the schools. Children from across Turkey came on spring field trips. They walked the trails in single file, holding hands, whispering when they saw her. One boy, maybe 9 years old, tapped me on the sleeve as I stood watching from the platform. "Is she the one?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "That's Alaz." He stared for a long time, then said, "She looks like she knows what she's doing." It was a simple comment. But I thought about it all week. That June, we noticed another extraordinary sign. Alaz was nesting. Not just idling, not sleeping in her usual pool. She had begun shaping a mound of mud and salt in a shallow rise near the geothermal edge, a behavior flamingos reserve exclusively for nesting. She wasn't alone. 2 of the juvenile followers had also begun similar mounds nearby. There was no precedent for this in recorded data from Lake Tuz. Flamingos bred here, yes, but always as part of the massive migratory influx. Never in winter, and never alone. And certainly never year-round residents. We kept our distance, not wanting to disrupt her. Cameras were set up 100 meters away, and volunteers enforced strict observation limits. That summer, Alaz laid a single egg. It hatched in early July. The chick, downy, pale gray, and unsteady, was dubbed Kivelsome by the schoolchildren. Spark. Like mother, like daughter. It was at that moment that I fully grasped what had happened. Alaz had altered the ecological story of Tuz Lake. She had done what no one expected a flamingo to do. She had not just survived, but created the conditions for new life. Her residency had begun as an accident. A wrong wind. A deviation. But she had found a way to thrive in one of the harshest environments in Turkey. And now, she had passed that resilience on. I was contacted by researchers in the Netherlands, Spain, and Kenya. They wanted data, comparative behavioral footage, access to the geothermal maps. Some even floated the idea of formally naming the subpopulation after her. One Turkish ecologist wrote to me, "What Alaz shows us is that nature is adjusting faster than we are. The systems are responding. We should be listening." And many began to listen. In October of 2024, the Turkish Ministry of Environment designated the geothermal marsh and its surrounding 12 kilometers as a priority conservation habitat. Alaz's zone, they called it in the briefings. Funding was secured to limit agricultural runoff. Plans were laid to restore upstream water channels and regulate borehole extraction. For the first time in years, there was cautious optimism. The Flamingo that had stayed became a pivot point for the lake's renewal. That winter, she and her small group remained. 6 in total now. Kivelsum was growing quickly, already standing near her mother's height. I watched her learn to feed, stumble, stretch her wings. And one day in late November, I saw her imitate Alaz perfectly, head tilted, legs still, scanning the water before dipping her beak. In that frozen stillness, I saw continuity. I don't romanticize nature. I've seen enough hardship on this lake to know that survival is not a storybook ending. It's struggle, adaptation, silence. But what Alaz gave me, was clarity. That even one quiet presence, determined and consistent, can shift the entire course of a place. In early 2025, Alaz's story was included in the National Biodiversity Curriculum for middle schools. A short film was produced by TRT and screened in nature festivals. And now, there is a small museum near the southern entrance of Tews Lake. Its final exhibit is a photograph taken at dawn, Alaz and Kivelsum standing side by side, still as statues, bathed in the early light. The caption is simple: the flamingo that stayed. And as for me, I still walk the lake every day. I still keep my notes. Still scan the horizon with binoculars. And every time I see her, still poised, still graceful, still watching, I know I am witnessing something rare. Not a miracle, not fiction, just nature, doing what it does best when given the space. Enduring.